Hey everybody, it's Wendy, and I'm here with this book, the Landmark History of the American People, and I'm here with Chapter 7. And so we've got a picture there, and we've got a timeline along the bottom there, page 48 and 49. And we have an early American oil well in the valley of Oil Creek, Pennsylvania. The oil was first pumped into vats, then poured into wooden barrels for shipment. It was a labor-intensive, dirty business, but way easier and more productive than whaling for blubber. So that was a wood graving, because of course they couldn't take pictures of things that were moving at that point. And then we've got a whole timeline on the bottom, which we are going to talk about while we read today. So the Indians had taught the early settlers how to raise new crops like corn and tobacco. They taught them how to find new medicines in the forests and underground. One of these medicines was a curious black oily substance that the Seneca Indians of upstate New York saw floating on ponds. They laid their blankets on top of the ponds where the oil was floating until the blankets had sucked up the oil. Then they wrung the oil out on the blankets into a bowl. They treasured the oil as an ointment, which they thought would cure all sorts of ills. Before the end of the 1700s, the American colonists had learned to use this oily medicine, and it became an item of trade with the Indians. It was called Seneca oil, after the Indians who sold it. Down in Kentucky in the 1830s, oil bubbled into a salt well and ruined it. The owners discovered that the black stuff was really Seneca oil. They stopped selling salt and instead went into the medical business, or medicine business. They put this stuff in bottles, called it rock oil or petroleum or American oil, and sold it as a remedy for rheumatism and nearly anything else. They sold these bottles by the hundreds of thousands. Other salt manufacturers who found this black stuff ruining their salt wells also went into the medicine business. One of them, Samuel Keir, put out leaflets boasting of his rock oil's wonderful curative powers. For rheumatism, chronic cough, ague, which I'm not sure what that word means, A-G-U-E. I'll define that for you in the bottom. Toothache, corns, neuralgia, piles, indigestion, and liver ailments. I think piles, I'm going to have to define a few of those words for you guys. I'm not sure what that is. He printed advertisements in the shape and size of paper money. These featured the number 400, the number of feet below the Earth's surface from which the oil was drawn, as if every drop of the oil was worth its weight in gold. To attract customers, Keir sent salesmen out all over the countryside in circus wagons. They played music, sang songs, displayed animal freaks, and used every possible means to attract attention and sell their magic fluid. Within a few years, Keir had disposed of 250,000 half pints of this wonderful rock oil at $1 a bottle. But Keir's wells gushed out even more than his clever salesman could sell. What could he do with the rest? About the same time that Keir and other salt manufacturers found themselves flooded with rock oil, there was a growing need for some inexpensive kind of lighting. In those days before electric lights, home lighting came from tallow candles and oil lamps. They weren't much different from the ones used in ancient Rome. A wick made from a twisted rag burned in a dish of fish oil, animal oil, or vegetable oil. That weak, flickering light of burning oil was all that people had to read, play, and work by as soon as the sun went down. But oil was expensive, so most people left their homes until at night, and people went to bed when the sun set. In the years before the Civil War, American cities were growing. Homes built close together lacked sunlight. At the same time, city people wanted to get together more in the evenings. New factories and railroads also required more and better artificial light. As early as 1830, Baltimore, Boston, and New York used gas, which was manufactured from coal, to light a few streets and public buildings. But people did not yet use gas in houses. And then you've got a picture there on the top of page 50 for Keir's Petroleum. Some help came when Isaiah Jennings invented a new lamp oil. He called it camphene. He used American turpentine, the yellowish sticky fluid that seeped out of holes made in certain pine trees. When processors heated this sticky stuff and mixed the product with alcohol, it made an excellent lighting fluid. It was much cheaper than other lighting oils, and when it burned, it gave a brighter, whiter light. But it had an unpleasant smell, and it gave off explosive gases. Nearly everybody agreed that American homes would not be bright at night until there was a safer, inexpensive lamp oil. But where could they find it? A hint of the great news source came in 1850 when a clever Canadian doctor, Abraham Gesner, found a way to make lightning oil from coal. He called his new product kerosene, from keros, the Greek word for wax. It had an unpleasant odor, but you could use it without danger of explosion. Doctors who had warned against the horrors of burning fluid now urged people to fill their lamps with the safe new coal oil. And before the end of 1859, manufacturers sold nearly 2 million coal oil lamps. But since there are about 30 million people in the United States, the country was still a long way from the goal of a lamp in every room. Dr. Gesner had showed that you could make lamp oil not only from plants and from animals, but also from coal. And coal was a mineral. Was it possible that people could use the new mineral product rock oil for lighting? About this time, a New Haven businessman named George H. Bizzle formed the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company. His purpose was to buy lands in western Pennsylvania where rock oil checked be found floating on ponds. I think there's an error there. His purpose was to buy lands in western Pennsylvania where rock oil checked be found. I think that word is wrong. It doesn't make sense. Could be found, maybe, floating on ponds. He hired a famous Yale professor of chemistry, Benjamin Silliman Jr., and that we would call that an unfortunate name because it's a little silly. Agreed to pay him $500 to find out what the rock oil was good for. Professor Silliman's report, and you probably pronounce it Silliman, opened a new age for rock oil. He discovered that rock oil, by now also called petroleum from petrus, Latin for rock and oleum for oil, would make an excellent oil for lamps. His process was cheap. He simply distilled the rock oil. That means he heated the oil and collected the gas that came off. When the gas cooled down into a liquid, it was lamp oil. This, Silliman discovered, was a new way to make kerosene that was just as good as kerosene made from coal. Kerosene made from rock oil also gave a bright white light and almost no smoke and would not explode. The rock oil itself also had wonderful lubricating powers. It would keep the wheels and gears of machines from wearing out and would make them run quiet and smooth. Rock oil, with these valuable uses, could surely be sold in large quantities. But until then, the only way anyone knew how to collect it was to find it on the surface or accidentally in a salt well. Sometimes people would dig a shallow ditch to increase the flow where it was already bubbling up. Then one day, the story goes, Bizzle saw one of Keir's advertisements. It was a sheet printed to look like a paper money that you see there on the top of page 50 and featured the numeral 400. AD 1848, it read, discovered in boring for saltwater about 400 feet below the Earth's surface. Boring. If you could obtain oil when you drilled for saltwater, why not simply drill for oil? Oil coming out of the ground, exclaimed a friend. Pumping oil out of the earth the way you pump water? Nonsense, you're crazy. But Bizzle and the other go-getting businessmen in the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company decided to try. They sent Edwin L. Drake out to the fields from New Haven, Connecticut. One reason they picked him was that since he had been a railroad conductor, he still had a free pass on the railroads. He could go out to western Pennsylvania without it costing anybody anything. When Drake reached Titusville, the town closest to the biggest finds of surface oil, he decided to drill for oil. But at first, he could not find a driller willing to do the job. The drillers all thought that boring for oil was silly. Then, luckily, he found an old salt driller, Uncle Billy Smith. Smith was also a skilled blacksmith and knew how to make drilling tools. Uncle Billy began drilling in June 1859. He reached bedrock only 32 feet below the surface, and then Uncle Billy could drill no more than 3 feet each day. Drake thought that to find oil, they might have to drill 1,000 feet. On Saturday, August 29, 1859, the hole still reached down less than 70 feet. When Drake and Smith came back on Monday morning, the hole was full of black, oily stuff. What's that? Drake said. Uncle Billy replied, that's your fortune. Soon there was an oil mania. Everybody wanted to get rich from oil. The map of northwestern Pennsylvania was dotted with such new names as Oil City, Oleopolis, and Petroleum Center. And here you have a picture there of the first oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The pointed wooden structure held a derrick for pulling up the drilling tools. Like the instant cow towns, these instant oil towns boomed. They were good places for salesmen and for swindlers. Swindlers are kind of people that cheat people out of their money. Some well diggers began doctoring their wells. They would pour buckets of oil into their holes at night to trick buyers who came to look the next morning. When Drake's first well began to gush oil, they put the oil into old whiskey barrels, wash tubs, and any other container in sight. But since the oil was flammable, it was dangerous to store in the open. The producers usually sealed the oil in barrels before loading it on wagons. Then they hauled it to the railroad or to docks on the nearest rivers. Since roads were poor, the best way to move the oil barrels was on flatboats. But in the streams nearest the oil wells, the water was usually too low to float the loaded flatboats. The clever oilmen then invented their own way of filling the creeks with water to float their oil barrels to the market. Their name for their system was the pond freshet. Freshet means a sudden flood of water. For example, on Oil Creek, each oilman made his own artificial pond held back by a dam. Then at signal, each quickly opened the dam of his own artificial pond. This suddenly flooded the creek. Only a few minutes before, the creek was much too shallow for the big flatboats. Now this man-made wave floated down the stream, and all the flatboats along the way were alert and ready. At just the right moment, each oilman pushed his loaded boats into the flood, which carried them quickly down to the railroad center. Just after a successful pond freshet, as an oilman recalled, the oil town was very much like a cow town after the arrival of a large Texas herd. Shippers are busy. Here's one person what they're writing about it. Ships are busy paying off the boatmen. The citizens of the creek are laying in a stock of the necessaries of life, and all is bustle and business. You see men dripping with the oleaginous, I don't know that word either, oleaginous. I'll have to try to look that one up also. Got lots of words to look up. Our hotels are filled to repletion with these greasy men who are supplying light for the world. Oil is the only topic of conversation, and the air is redolent with its sweet perfumery. John D. Rockefeller was the great success in oil, one of the most spectacular of all American go-getters. He was not an inventor or an explorer. He was an organizer. Rockefeller's talent was like that of Charles Goodnight, who had collected thousands of cattle for the long drive. Young Rockefeller went to school in Cleveland, Ohio, but he never went to college. His father, who traveled through the West selling patent medicines, left young John in charge of the family long before he was grown. John D. Rockefeller was ambitious. I did not guess what it would be, he recalled, but I was after something big. Even as a boy, he was systematic and well-organized. While still struggling to make his way, he gave 1/10 of his income to the Baptist church and to charities. But when it came to organizing his oil business, he did not always use Sunday school methods. Cleveland was a good place to organize something big in the oil business. Cleveland was at the receiving end of the 2 railroads that came from the western Pennsylvania oil fields. It was also on a lake big enough for large ships. Rockefeller determined to make Cleveland the center of the oil business, and from there to command the biggest oil company in the world. In 1865, beginning with a small sum he had made in a grain trading business, he bought his first Cleveland refinery. There he turned crude oil from the fields into kerosene for lighting and oil for lubricating. Then he brought up the smaller refineries in Cleveland and many oil wells in western Pennsylvania. There's a picture there, a magazine cartoon published 2 years after Drake's first oil strike. Wales, whose blubber had been an important source of lamp oil, had good reason to celebrate the discovery of mineral oil. As the new oil industry prospered, the whaling industry declined, because that's where they used to get it from. As other oilmen went out of business, the railroads needed Rockefeller's freight more than ever. He was clever at making the 2 Cleveland railroads compete for business. He bargained with one railroad by threatening to give all his business to the other, and he finally forced them to charge him lower prices than they charged anyone else. He did this by secret arrangement, so other customers of the railroad could not know for sure what was happening. He pretended to pay the same price the railroad charged everyone else. Then the railroad secretly gave him back a refund on each barrel of his oil that they had hauled. After he perfected these tactics, he went to the small refiners in other parts of the country and asked them to sell to him. If you don't sell your property, he would say, it will be valueless because we have advantages with the railroads. But we don't want to sell, they would say. You can never make money, Rockefeller would reply. You can't compete with the Standard Oil Company. We have all the large refineries now. If you refuse to sell, it will end in your being crushed. He would then offer a price far below what the owners thought their refineries were worth. But they usually sold because they realized that Rockefeller could drive them out of business. This is kind of a monopoly, kind of sad. And we have some protections in place in our country now that prevent these types of things from happening a bit better. When it became cheaper to pump oil through pipelines instead of carrying it in barrels, Rockefeller organized his own pipeline. Then, when explorers found a different kind of oil in Ohio, Rockefeller hired chemical engineers to invent new kinds of refineries. Rockefeller's go-getting business reached around the world. To the Chinese, his Standard Oil Company sold inexpensive lamps by the millions, and then sold the oil to fill them. Before long, people on all the continents were using lamp oil from the American wells. Between the Civil War and 1900, over half the American output went abroad. So over half of what we got in oil went overseas. In those years, the giant go-getter John D. Rockefeller helped light up the world. Now Americans could afford a lamp in every room. In the 20th century, or the 1900s, Rockefeller's business would grow in ways he had never imagined. After the automobile became popular, Rockefeller's companies began refining petroleum into gasoline. And Rock Oil Petroleum made it possible for a whole nation to move on wheels. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 7. And I'm going to post a few items for you. So just take a look at the notes for this. And then I wanted to see, I'm in the wrong section here. Sorry, I went into chapter 7. Sorry about that. Yeah. Chapter 7. So we've got some words here. Oh, it actually has it defined here. So I'll post the pictures of some of these vocabulary words for you, and you guys can take a look at those. So the Seneca Indians, what did they have to do with the oil they collected? They used it as an ointment. Why isn't turpentine ideal for use of lighting oil? How was kerosene the same? How was it different? So turpentine had an unpleasant smell and gave off explosive gases. Kerosene also had an unpleasant odor, but it could be used without danger of explosion. Pond freshet was a clever invention by oilmen to fill the creeks with water to float their oil barrels to the market. And I'm going to see if I can find a video to show you how that works. Two characteristics made Cleveland a good place to organize a big oil business. It was at the receiving end of two railroads that came from the western Pennsylvania oil fields, and it was on a lake big enough for large ships. The whaling industry declined because they didn't need their blubber anymore for the whale oil. Rockefeller would persuade small oil refiners to sell out to him by telling him that basically, you know, they're going to be crushed because this big company is going to do better than them. And he was kind of a bully. That was kind of a really mean thing to do, and a bully thing to do, if you think about it. Okay, so, and I'm looking here on my timeline. It looks like Zoe, who's keeping track of the timeline, Rockefeller formed Standard Oil was in 1870. It also said here, Zoe, on Tuesday, the Colorado Gold Rush was 1858 to 1861. Also, with the Visual Encyclopedia, the shootout at the OK Corral was 1881. The flight of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce was 1877. Sand Creek Massacre was 1862. Battle of the Little Bighorn was 1876. And the massacre at Wounded Knee was 1890. And the rest of you don't worry about that, but Zoe likes to have the timeline dates that are in here for a special book that she has back at home. So that is it.